So thank you again for joining us for today's Succession Planning for Staff webinar, or as our facilitator today has listed on his presentation, "Oh no, our boss is gone." We are excited to have George Myers, our facilitator today, join us. We've been fortunate to have grant funding from the USDA, which has allowed us to bring in outside expertise to help our affiliates. And so many of you, I think, had the opportunity to meet George at Camp Colorado. He has worked with nonprofit for years, and specifically I know George from our time together at Habitat International. So he has a wealth of nonprofit experience both as a staff member, a volunteer, and a board member. So with that, I am going to turn things over and let George get started.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen. Is this volume good for everybody? As far as you know?
Sounds good to me, since I'm the only one not muted.
Okay, let's go for that, just so long as you can hear me and I'm not talking into outer space. So I really do appreciate this opportunity to interact with Habitat Colorado again and to really talk a little bit about succession planning. It's been very much a hot topic of a lot of the clients that I'm working with, and we'll talk about some of the reasons maybe why that is in here. So we will just get moving here. We've got a lot to cover. This will really cover today how this works on the staff or management side of our nonprofits. We will have another webinar we'll promote here at the end next month that will talk more about board leadership and just nominations and recruitment, keeping your board strong. But this one is really how to sort of keep in planned and unplanned succession planning. So attendees will leave with an understanding on the importance of this. You'll also have an awareness on how to handle an emergency loss or that unplanned transition, and then a planned transition of leadership, which is affecting more and more nonprofits today too. And we will spend a little bit of time, hopefully at the end, talking with some questions and think about a plan and a strategy for you, and I'll give you some nice tools for that. So the first thing is, it's a very simple one, is we have a little poll here, and the question is, do you have a succession plan? Yes, no, or maybe. So I'll give you a few seconds to jump in and tell us where you're at. So I think, Karen, they're supposed to be able to click a box and tell us how they are going to answer this poll. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so not kidding. We got one vote. We've got one no vote so far. 2 no votes. This is pretty typical. Give you another 5 seconds here. So everybody says no. We will show the results then. Yep, 100% no. So what we're going to talk about today, which is probably why you're on the call, is what is succession planning and why we need it, what to do when it's going to happen to you, who should have a plan, and what you and your organization can do to be ready for this. So again, back to that who question first. Obviously, the top leadership, the executive director, but probably there's other key staff in your organization who could benefit from having some succession planning, some construction people, just other key people that sort of keep the wheels turning. And it could even be an administrative person or something that you just don't know how you'd get by without him or her. And we will talk about in the next one more about, again, what happens when board officers, particularly someone who's served for a long time or has been vitally important to your affiliate, is rolling off or moving. Sometimes people just move away or other life changes happened. So, we'll talk through why. Well, of course, we have the planned ones like retirement or a new job, or somebody else in the family has a new job, or they get more unplanned as somebody gets fired. And maybe that's planned or maybe it's unplanned. But more of the unplanned ones we see are definitely around injuries, accidents, illnesses, and other personal reasons. And I think one of the things to think about through this whole piece is, as much as we work with people and that we want to separate the person from the personality as much as possible as we go through this. This is a great quote I like. Leaders need to view success in terms of what is best for the long-term health and vitality of the context for their leadership, as opposed to what's best for them as individuals. If an organization's efforts fall apart the minute a leader is gone, then that leader did not do what was necessary to assure long-term success. And that comes from Making Neighborhoods Whole, Wayne Gordon and John Perkins, and the Christian Community Development Association. Those guys are authors for them, who do a lot with developing leaders, particularly indigenous or neighborhood leaders and young people. But the idea being here that, again, if the position is more about your personality and your ego is really involved in it, it's probably going to be harder to change that around, to think more about what's best for your affiliate and the long-term success of that. This is really a toxic topic. It's a harsh word, but this really does have a lot of feelings involved with it. It's got a lot of possibilities. It can also be very, very labor intensive to replace a key person. It's high stakes, it's stressful, and it can be really costly if you make a mistake as you go through this. People do not like change. Change should not be a crisis, and as we mentioned already, this really does go deeper than the ED, but for sure we need to look at the ED. What we find across the spectrum of nonprofit organizations and Habitat affiliates is rarely does this show up in strategic planning. And of course, even if it does, any plan is only as good as the people and their interest and ability to follow through in it. I actually have a client right now, and one of the core goals that we've worked on is succession planning for their leadership in their departments and then also their board. So a few assumptions. This comes from a Compass Point study, and we'll look at some Compass Point materials later on as outside resources that Karen will be able to send you. Really, transitions are very rare in nonprofits versus for-profit world. People, when they're good, tend to stick around for a long time and become very invested, which goes back to where we have to be careful about that personality versus the programs that you're trying to run in Habitat. Most leaders are pretty satisfied and have long tenure. We do find when people do leave, it tends to sometimes be quickly and often with a feud that happens, that there's just something that just changes in the dynamic with the board a lot of times. But, one of the things the Compass Point study came up with is that many people are planning on leaving, at least they say they're going to leave within the next 3 years, but they haven't talked about it. They are afraid to say something about it. And we're finding that many will not continue in nonprofit leadership, which is, of course, critical for finding your new ED. Is that person really out there? We also see often that a departure can jeopardize key funding relationships, or you might lose volunteers or board members if somebody leaves unexpectedly or is terminated. Sabbaticals and leaves are one way that we go away from burning people out and maybe keeping people at a longer tenure, but they're very rare around Habitat particular. But the other side of this is that boomers are retiring, and we really do have some concerns about the leaders stepping up to this. Again, Compass Point found that many of our highest level nonprofits in the country are staffed by people who probably will retire in the next 5 years, maybe 10 years. I know here in Oregon, where I live, one of the major foundations just announced yesterday their CEO is leaving, and he's one of many people we'll see transition out in the next few years. And the other side of this whole coin is Gen X and Gen Y are looking closely at things in the nonprofit world and see that this job tends to be very, very stressful at times, a lot of hours and low pay, and it's very hierarchical, and they are not necessarily buying into thinking that that's the career that they want to pursue and to just leap into an open position or climb that nonprofit corporate ladder. So what we are finding is many may want to restructure into co-leadership or cooperative, collective, shared leadership models, and that these may actually be not such a bad idea and offer us a better work-life balance. So the younger generation may have something here, and we may really see some transitions. It's sort of an interesting time. These are two books that I'm going to throw out here just that talk about change management. This is really a transition of particularly your key leadership is a organizational transition and change, and there are people who are way smarter than me that have talked about this. Particularly, I'd call your attention to John Cotter or William Bridges, and they have many books out on change management. So, and we see change happen. We see unexpected things happen. One of the things we've noticed in the Boy Scouts, they always prepared people, as they try to have a 3 deep leadership policy, so that if they're taking a bunch of kids out on a backpacking trip, there's always somebody available to be able to fully take over as leader, and often they try and have 2 people in those positions. So if someone needed to leave for some reason, take someone home, or if there was a crisis or emergency, again, someone else is there that can lead. So this would be a big question is, can you get to this point in your nonprofit where there's always at least somebody 2 deep behind you? And we see this too in the world of athletics. I'm a Green Bay Packers fan, so I had to put up a Packers picture, but developing your internal bench strength is really important. Football teams always have at least 1 backup quarterback, if not 2, sometimes even more, even if they have a star. And that sort of says that, we're going to have that next leader behind us and somebody ready to step up and just take over immediately. And I hear often rural areas, less populated areas, who do we turn to? How can we make sure we have this? And the big key to this is typically we'll see some key volunteers or even board members be ready to sort of step in if there's an unplanned transition. We're going to shift for a minute here. We will get to some questions in just a minute, but I want to just run through this little scenario of how do we work with a planned departure. So as I just mentioned, we had a foundation announce that in late 2018, their director of many years is going to leave. So they're following this precisely as I look at this. They're going to have a succession plan in place. They've already announced it. They have not announced anybody, even if the gentleman has a successor that he'd like to see come forward, his backup quarterback. That person may not be the right one. And the board in particular, or if you're looking at a key position within your organization, you as the executive director have to really figure out early on whether this internal, external promotion is the way you want to go. And someone that's a great manager may not be a great leader. There's definitely the idea of the Peter Principle, and we see this at play all the time. Someone we think is doing well in their current position just may not be ready to climb up that one more rung. And we'll talk a little bit more about interims, but this is where you would consider whether you should use an interim director or an interim position. And again, if it is the executive director, the board has to be really closely involved with this, and it is their hire. Mentioning Compass Point again, one of the handouts we'll have for you as a resource at the end is another one that would let, if it's you as the director and you're thinking about leaving, it starts to have you formulate some ideas about your legacy and what is it you're leaving behind and what is it that you'd like to help think about for the next position, the next person to fill your position. So, again, how do we do this well? We want to make sure that we plan about this. There really should be a succession plan in place. We want to make sure that you are very solid on your vision, mission, and goals. Often we'll see a strategic planning process take place. Again, thinking about this nonprofit, they actually finished this foundation actually coincidentally finished a strategic plan last year that's going to carry them through the next 5 years. So this fits in really well with this model. We want to make sure the financial systems are really strong. One of the recommendations out there is that you would have 3 months of cash reserves, so just as a new person comes in and funders may want to just really feel comfortable with this person, that's a great way to just make sure you carry this through. I'm actually serving an interim position right now, and the biggest crisis that happened was the fact that the previous person who was asked to leave had not been doing the fundraising that was expected of them, and so cash is really, really tight for them. That's not a great way to have a nice, smooth, planned transition. We also want to work with the funders, and even we have seen places where funders will make a commitment a few years out. This is a great, again, belief not in the person who's running the organization, but showing that they believe in the organization and the mission itself. As we go through that 18th month period, we'll watch, I'm sure probably in about 9 months, this search process for the next person will come through. And, there is a process of celebration and letting go as we do this. We'll talk a little bit more about some of these pieces too, even if it's a planned or unplanned one in a few minutes. How do we make the change happen? Well, we do not just immediately jump out and search for a new leader. We really need to make sure the organization knows where it wants to go. It has that strategic plan. It has that solid financial base if possible. We also shouldn't expect a hero if this was a less than happy transition out the door. We can't imagine that the next person is going to come in and be exactly who it was. And you can't wait for the new guy to come in or girl to come in and fix it. You need to really fix yourself first, is the phrase I'll use. I'm going to tell a Habitat story here. There was a board president I worked with long ago back in Minnesota in my career who was working in an all-volunteer affiliate at the time, and they were looking at finally bringing in an office manager, so they did finally bring in some staff. But basically, he was the person that not only was leading the board, he was running around town and finding the lots that they would build on. He was one of the main crew leaders at the construction site. He was the one that was speaking at all the churches. He was the one that was working with the local corporate giving and Kiwanis and bankers and everyone else, really bringing the money in the door. And he was very involved as a family partner, too, with the families. He was very close to the families as they worked with them. He got pretty tired and announced one year that he was done. He was just going to step back from Habitat. He'd already retired once. This was another full-time job almost, and he was ready to leave. And this created just absolute panic in the organization because no one, his shoes, if you will, had grown so big that there wasn't another person anywhere in the organization ready to step into those big shoes that Gary had. And what we ended up doing is really making some plans, talking about the roles he was playing, and we actually subdivided his president role into about 4 other positions. So we found someone else to work on the fundraising piece. We found someone else to work on the site selection piece. And we then had someone who was willing to step up and lead the organization as board president. So this is a great way to see how transition can happen well. A couple more slides, and then we're going to get to some questions here. Bear with me. So one of the studies McKinsey and Company did was looking at, in the for-profit world, whether that external CEO selection would outperform internal CEOs. And they found out that they did, about 5 to 1 in terms of how well they took their companies forward. But when they looked at the top producing CEOs, most of those had come from the inside. They're individuals who managed to combine the boldness and external perspective and the willingness to challenge the sacred cows, but also with the knowledge of how to influence the organization that insiders have. So what we find is that insiders often make sense. They will come in with a great understanding of the organization. They need space and support, but they may not be ready to challenge the sacred cows or the status quo. Whereas outsiders will come in, and hopefully you're hiring someone who's got some new ideas, ready to make some change. They're also dispassionate. They are not engaged and involved. And because of that, it'll take some time to figure out the levers of power. How do we get things done? How do things work? As we all know, Habitat's a pretty complex little animal. How does a new person come in, even if they're a great manager from another organization, nonprofit, or even from a for-profit background? How do they fit into Habitat and all the things that we do? And they're going to know where the bodies are buried. They're going to have to find out where those were. What happened here? What do I need to know about this situation? So we're going to take a break for some questions.
And if you have a question, feel free to just type it into the chat box, and we'll just pause for a second to let you do that.
Any questions out there?
So one question I see, George, is organizations that you know of that have succession plans, that have prioritized that and haven't been kind of scared off by the concept, kind of the why. Why have they been successful? Has it been has the ED been the driver, a board member? Have they put it in their strategic plan? Kind of what makes that organization prioritize that?
I think there's been a lot of buzz about it. So I think this is one of the things we're going to see, and that's probably being driven mostly by the baby boomers starting to roll out. When we have a nice, smooth, planned retirement coming up, like this foundation I keep talking about, it's easy for them to think about it. I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't even talk about it in their strategic planning last year. So I know for me as a consultant, I'm always looking at that and advocating that, whether I'm doing a board assessment or evaluation or organizational assessment, or also looking at planning, is what are you prepared to do? We hear a lot about emergency plans, what happens if a tornado hits or an earthquake hits or a fire comes or something, but we don't hear about how do we replace a person rather than all your files. So I think it's becoming important, is I guess the best answer I'd have for that. It's picking up on the radar screens.
And it looks like Janet has a question in terms of, is it important to get the board involved from the start in defining the plan?
Particularly for the executive director, yes. And I think the board can also make it clear that this is something that they would like to see within the organization. Again, I think usually people will also, why do people do it? Well, because something happened and they went through this and said, okay, we're not going to let that happen again. So the board will step up and tell the executive director that they need to make sure their family services person or whoever's been through MPAR or who's ever worked through, who does the shop plans. Again, I remember a very small one-person affiliate back in my career who had a shop grant, and that person quit, and suddenly it was like, oh my goodness, nobody else knows how to deal with shop. And so that was also one of those learning lessons that you may not be the absolute top leader in the organization, creating mission and vision and raising lots of money, but you may be doing something with a grant that nobody else knows how to do. So the board needs to sort of see that and make sure that it's happening through the organization.
And Sherry, thank you. And Sherry had a question about developing succession plans for other key staff. So, do these the same information you're sharing apply to staff? Who would be driving those succession plans? Maybe elaborate a little bit more on other key staff outside of executive directors.
So again, that would be very much the executive director would want to be making sure that their staff had plans. And the last part of here today, we'll talk about and we'll look at an affiliate that did exactly that. How did the ED make sure that their other staff people had literally a binder sitting at their desk that helped with that. So we'll look at some great things like that. Good tee off there, Sherry. So shall we go forward?
Yes.
Great. So what have you experienced in your career? So we've got a bunch of choices for people. You can pick all that apply, and this isn't just Habitat. It's throughout your whole career, watching your leader or your boss get fired, watching your leader quit and walk out the door, watching your leader or boss leave for a new job, and this should say after a few weeks they depart, or seeing someone retire, or someone's injured and gets sick and can't work, or have you never seen any of this? So you can check as many of these as you want. We'll give you about 15, 20 seconds to chime in on these. So feel free to, anything that you've seen in your career that you've had happen to you.
And we did have a comment from Sherry that she has seen all of them.
All of them? Okay. Well, then you could have checked them all, Sherry. Okay, we're going to close this up here. So, yep. I think more of you have seen someone get fired, and then it's like, okay, now what do we do? Because often a firing is a very unplanned succession. So we're going to talk about that as we go on here. What could go wrong? I work out here in Oregon, and we watched a local nonprofit who had an executive director that had run the organization for 20 years. There was a new board chair came in 2015. All of a sudden, it hit the newspapers actually out here that the ED walked out in April 2016, so within a few months. And she publicly announced that she just said it was time to move on, and that she didn't feel that the board and her were going in the same direction. The board says that they spent more time. They wanted her to spend more time fundraising, and they didn't feel that they were getting the financial goals met. They declined to bring in an interim or look for outside help. What they did, so she walked out in April. In May, they announced to the community that they were appointing an existing staffer as the interim ED. She was expected to do her own job as well as the job of the executive director, and she made it clear that she was also interested in becoming the full-time executive director. Funders pulled back. Several board members quit. The ED changed her public tune about why she left and was talking to some of these funders. And then after another month or so in August, or in July, the board chair that sort of instigated all this, she resigned along with other board members. They were down to 4 people on their board. More funders pulled away, and in August the organization completely shut down and disclosed that, yes, they were really in debt. And they went out of business. So what everyone in the community thought was a very firm and solid 20-year organization was gone in less than 6 months from the public eye. So that's an extreme example, but we do find that sometimes it is just time for people to leave. Maybe in this case the board should have taken action sooner. Maybe they shouldn't have taken it. Maybe they could have done something else differently. But really to look at how do you work on or improve a situation, and then do people have the willingness to do that? One of the things that I think in this lesson that didn't happen was that they did not use an interim. And I think what we're finding is that interims really create, even in a planned situation, interims really give you a chance of time to reflect, assess, regroup, and not rush with and bring in an outside perspective. They can keep the lights on and keep urgent tasks moving forward. In this situation we had in this small nonprofit, the staff person they had made the interim was still expected to do all her regular work too. They reduce stress, bring stability, particularly if you've had a long-term 20-year tenure or a founder, they can really help mitigate that. We'll often see in nonprofits that when the new person comes in, it doesn't matter who they are. They may just fail because they aren't the previous person. Again, I've been around Habitat for a long time, and when Millard Fuller was let go, and Jonathan, we actually did have an interim. Paul Leonard came in for a brief period of time, and then they brought in Jonathan Reckford. And I know there were many people that were prepared to see Jonathan fail, no matter how good a person he was or how skilled a person he was in the first year, simply for the fact that he wasn't at Millard. Fortunately, Jonathan has proven himself to be a great leader. They came in with a strategic plan at the same time, and they had the interim. So I think that helped Habitat International weather through what could have been a pretty major blow to transition. They did really well. And those of you that go to church, many denominations will actually mandate that you have an interim, regardless of why a pastor or a priest left. You may have an interim. And again, in my world of interims, we never should be a candidate for the position. So when this does happen, whether it's planned or unplanned, you really do need to say why the ED is leaving, highlight the tenure and some of the things that can happen, tell people what is happening and what will happen next. The more you say is better than less. Set an expectation. It's going to take several months. Really use letters, press releases, etc. Announce that a search committee is forming. This is exactly where I am in the interim I'm doing right now. We've done every one of these things. We're just about to release the job description and let people know how the search is going. And when the new director comes in, we will celebrate that. And then we'll also make sure that the new leader is out there and really being as publicly in the public eye as much as possible the first few months. So we're going to step back a little bit here to talk about how do we figure out where we want to go. And this goes not only beyond the strategic plan, but it probably is good to reflect a little bit about what are our core values, what is non-negotiable about Habitat, what's causing us the biggest tension or worry right now. We find that's funding a lot of times, but we also find that no executive director is ever going to be perfect. No staff person is ever going to be perfect, and they tend to possibly leave a few little things that you don't know about, or maybe you do know about them. Maybe you do know, like this nonprofit I mentioned a few minutes ago, that they really were $150,000 in debt and that their funding was falling away. We want to make sure that you really understand the culture of the organization and someone who can come in and understand what can change and what cannot change. So what we see is that just really, as you think about, it's a great time to review the job description. I was a Habitat interim ED a few years ago at an affiliate. They had actually gone through 3 EDs in 3 years, and one of the things that we did is we stabilized the organization. Again, as I talked through a few minutes ago, the advantages of having that interim position for the executive director was just crucial for them, because we could sit down and know that things were moving, but we could take time to assess and figure out what do we need next. One of the things we realized is that they had been using about a 6-page job description, and fundraising was, I think it was bullet point 15 out of 17 of the duties of the executive director. Those of you on the phone who are executive directors probably understand this perfectly. But what the organization's top need was the executive director doing development work. So we took that 4-page job description and made it into a 2-page job description, with fundraising being the number one duty for the director. We want to make sure we understand what performance measures are going to happen in the first 3 months. We want to make sure this person that comes in is going to perform and has a clear vision, has clear direction from the board as to exactly what they want to do. Or if you're hiring, if you're the executive director and hiring another staff person, what is it that they need to come in and do for the organization? What are the skills and experience they bring? And does that updated job description really link the values and strengths of your organizations with who you need? This was a great quote, came in from the National Association of Housing Cooperatives. Boards don't take the most qualified candidate, take the one that fits best and has the qualifications to do the job. And candidates don't take the offer just because there's not something better. A bad job fit is a bad job, and you'll be unhappy, and everybody else will be unhappy too. So again, this is another advantage of an interim. You don't have to rush through the process. You can take your time and know that the day-to-day things are being taken care of. So we're going to shift now in the last section here, and we'll get to some questions again in just a few minutes. Of the unplanned, the emergency one. This often is a great place to start because it's easier to think about what's going to happen if the executive director can't come into work. Again, my Habitat career, I'll tell you a story about a woman that was sitting in her office in the building, and it was one of these crazy things you see on the internet where suddenly a car in the street driving by lost control and came through the office window and the wall of the office and pinned her against her desk. And her life changed in 5 seconds. She was badly injured. She wanted to return to work. She kept trying to come back. It was a very difficult situation for the board because she did want to return to work, and she just finally decided physically she was unable to. But that was almost a year for that to play through. Again, we want to think through that process, not the person as much. Sometimes you have to say what's best for the organization, and they finally did. As much as they wanted the ED to come back, they just realized that the organization had to move forward without her. This is something that could be essential for everyone in your organization. We're always going to assume that short-term absence, again, the one that I'm speaking about, we looked at it in, first it was 30 days. Would she be back in 30 days? Then would she be back in 60 days, 90 days, and going forward by then? We really want to make sure people have identified their backup people and who's above them. So maybe one of the ways to get to that 2 deep or 3 deep is who's above you and who's below you. And make sure that people keep information updated frequently. That's probably in succession planning for these unplanned pieces. This is the most important thing. And it comes down to simple things like what's the password to get into the computer? How many people have access to the checking account? So great things. We're going to talk through some ways on how to do a succession plan There's a template that is available in our resources that we'll be talking about at the end, that comes from the Center for Nonprofit Advancement. And it's very, very specific about, it literally goes into pages. What are the insurance policy numbers? Who is taking care of the telephone systems? So it can be looked at almost as that disaster plan, as well as what do we need to know in case an executive director or a key staff person departs. So this is my suggestion, though, is as we think about building a succession plan for yourself, just on the next vacation, maybe not every vacation, have your backup, build your plan, and have your backup try and do most of your work, not just let it pile up. See what would happen if you were gone. Pretend you're dead, that you can only be reached in an absolute emergency, and then maybe think about trying it out on a larger scale. Take a month off, or, as we mentioned earlier, we might have longer tenure of people if we offered things like sabbaticals or opportunities for longer leaves. So that's a gutsy thing to say, but it might work. I'm going to stop and talk about a few resources, and we'll stop and talk about questions, and we'll have one last thing to look at. To mention the emergency succession planning template, Karen, you're going to be able to send these out at the end, I believe. There also was, we're going to send you NPQ article. They've actually been focusing in on this a lot, particularly in the past few months, of transitions. They don't call it succession planning there. They're talking about leadership transitions. And there was an excellent webinar they did in March, and we'll be able to send you the link for that and some of the resources they've done. We have some articles from Bridgespan, which also talks about that. We have, this is a great resource book too, the Nancy Axelrod Succession Planning Guide. It comes from BoardSource. And you should be able to get a discount, of course, if you're a BoardSource member through Habitat International. Annie Casey Foundation has funded Compass Point. Habitat Colorado is a good resource on some of this. If you're not in Colorado, there might be another state nonprofit association, and you can always reach out to me. Some of the other ones we're going to do is, or send to you, is, again, just some basic reflection articles and other pieces like that too. So that should be big help. Okay, we're going to stop and ask for a few more questions. Karen, and I'm hoping that you're going to be able to send things out, and you may be muted.
I'm not muted, but yes. So following the call, all of these resources, you should be getting actually a notification from ReadyTalk, and it'll have the attachments listed, but I also will send them out with a link to the webinar too. So just in case they don't come through that way, you will be getting them. And I don't see any questions at this time, George. So if you want to, just keep continuing on, and then I know you have a chance at the end too in case anything comes up.
Sure. So the simplest thing you can do, what's the first step to take from this, all the stuff I've dumped on you, is I think really start at that, what happens in an emergency. Nobody's talking about quitting. Nobody's looking like they're going to get fired. Nobody's looking like they're going to retire right now. So the proactive step is to say, what would happen to any of us if, I got hit by a bus today or tomorrow, or a streetcar if you're in San Francisco or wherever else you are, that suddenly you're sick or injured and you cannot come to work. So there should be an emergency handbook probably at the level for the organization, of some of those key things like what are the bank account numbers, who has access to credit cards, things like that. Probably some of this will come into the policies and procedures. Make sure that you really have HR policies spelled out on how to do what happens in a situation like this. Maybe even put it in there to say you would seek an interim, and just know that you don't have to panic and think about it, that that's something you would do. And then the next one is to say, okay, all of my key employees, we want to do an emergency binder. This is a pretty simple thing to do. I'm going to show you. I hope you can read this slide. These are actual Habitat employees out here in Oregon. Angela says Angela moved to Seattle to join the improv scene and drink coffee by the water. So the first thing you can do is figure out what's your binder going to say. Gone to Sandpoint, Idaho. That's their finance person. You can see her spreadsheets back there. And the construction manager for when Darlene runs away to write her award-winning novel. So probably an easy thing for you to think about doing is, first off, just make that fun title. The second one is to say who needs to know where it is. I mean, obviously there are some privacy things and passwords and things like that need to be protected, but they could even be spelled out as to step one, how to go get the password, who knows the password, and any other, particularly any other financial or security pieces that you're doing in your job. What I usually recommend, if I was doing this in a workshop at Camp Colorado, we would be sitting down right now in the last 15 minutes of our workshop, and I would make you list 10 key things that your backup would have to do, and probably 5 things that have to be done this week, and 5 or are done on a monthly basis, and then 5 things that are done more long term. This is one of those key areas also to make sure that it keeps getting updated, that you really make sure that some of these key tasks and hot things that you're working on, probably every 3 to 6 months, take a moment to redo that short list. You need to probably make a list of key people that they would need to work with. Who is your contact at the bank, or who is the person at SHOP that you work with, or capacity building, or Vista, or anything else that you're doing. Who do you talk to at Habitat Colorado? And then think about what other important information that you would need to put in there. So we're going to send you out a template about this too, and you can go off the emergency planning template also that's being sent out. But even if you have 4 or 5 pages of just, here's my key contacts outside of the office, here's and how to get hold of them, and here's why you would need to talk to them, here's the things that have to happen every month, here's the things that I'm working on right now. So again, back to my example with the beach scene, if you could take your next vacation and not answer emails and not do any of your work, would somebody in the office be able to, or a volunteer or a board member, be able to come in and keep those critical pieces moving? I think we, at least particularly for a short term, not everything is going to happen. But, what are the critical pieces so that if we think back to that first slide, the organization doesn't falter and fall apart. So step 2, the deeper one, is have that very real conversation with your leader or founder. What are your long-term plans? How many more years do you think you're going to work? Is someone in your family thinking about looking at a career move? It's just very healthy if this type of conversation happens openly, honestly, and it gives people a chance to really talk about what may happen, because then you can be prepared that 12 to 18 months out. And the finance manager whose picture you just saw, she did that. She said, I would like to retire by January 2017, and they made a plan at the affiliate to hire her replacement, bring him on, and go through the training that the new person needed to take over her job. So I mentioned the What's Your Legacy self-assessment. That'll come out. And then my best tip to you is just make sure that you put this into your next plan. So in closing, transition should really be seen ultimately as an opportunity to grow. You allow God and or the collective guidance of your board to guide you, or good management skills, and just really look ahead. It will happen, and if it hasn't happened yet, it will, and you just really need to be ready. So we got about 5 minutes left, it looks like. Karen, do we have any questions yet?
Feel free to type in any questions that you might have. I know one question we have, George, is actually bringing up these conversations with your staff just to make sure that it's a positive experience and not putting somebody on the defensive in terms of developing a succession plan. Any tips for going through these exercises with staff members?
Well, I think the biggest one is that they can see that this becomes an organizational effort, or it showed up in a strategic or operational plan. And so, if it was just me being asked to do that and none of my coworkers were being asked to do that, I might get a little nervous. But if we look at that all the key people that you identify need these, then it becomes much more clear that why this is being done. So, and again, I think just being open and transparent, and it's hard if you haven't been through it. Trust me, if your organization has been through one of these catastrophic unplanned losses, particularly due to an accident or an injury, this is not a hard conversation to then have for everybody else, because they'll have been through it and realized, whoa, we weren't prepared for that. So I think this is, just as the Red Cross and people try and get us ready for wildfires and tornadoes and earthquakes, we also need to be proactive about just what happens at our personnel levels.
Any other questions for George while we have him on the line? Well, it looks like you and your resources have covered it. That's always good to know.
Yep. So we will, like I say, I'm going to promote part 2. We're going to be doing this on May 11th, 12 noon Mountain Time. We're going to talk about boards, because as I mentioned a few minutes ago in that story about the board president, keeping the best people possible ready to lead the organization is also critically important at the board level too. And so we'll talk not only through some succession planning ideas for them, but really this evolves much more into just strong nominations and in making sure that we have a board that is sustaining itself and is planning. I think boards can be a little bit more deliberate. But they still need some planning, and they occasionally have an unplanned transition too. So I hope we can join this for that, and thank you really so much, Habitat Colorado and Karen, for putting this on today. I've got my contact information on here. I would be happy, we've got this all recorded, so I don't need to share this presentation. But then you'll get the resources, and there's more things out there. Just ask me if you'd like it. And I do consulting, and I do give special pricing to Habitat affiliates, because I'm still a big Habitat fan.
Well, and thank you, George, very much again for sharing your expertise. And I would definitely recommend those of you on the line, and when I send you out the webinar, I think this would be a great webinar to share with your board of directors. I think there's some really good information there too, as well as the upcoming webinar on succession planning for boards and boards recruitment. I'm definitely a big fan of your own board of directors being involved in that recruitment process, so please share that link with them. And definitely later today I will be sending all this information out. So thank you again for your time during this lunch hour, and thank you again to George. We really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye-bye.